Hey, and welcome to the Rabbit Trail Podcast. We are on episode number 85.
85.
I know, this is exciting. And if you're joining us, we want to welcome you. My name is Greg Harris. I'm the senior pastor at Olive Branch Community Church in Corona, California. And we'd love to hear from you wherever you're listening or whatever. But this is the podcast where we chase truth wherever it runs. We usually will pick up stuff from a sermon previous on Sunday, or we'll answer your questions from you guys sending them in. So we're excited that you're joining with us. And my co-hosts with me are...
I'm Stephen Oldham, the local outreach coordinator here at Olive Branch. And let us know what format you're listening to us on. And we've been trying to get some of that data from you guys to just see, how the service is working on your particular end, whether it's Apple iTunes or whatever. Make sure you subscribe. Let us know you're listening to the podcast and give us 5 stars or a thumbs up or however you're...
And if you're having internet problems, that's not us. That's not our problem. That's not what we're saying.
We're just noticing like different formats have, like I said, different kind of audio problems. And we've been really working on our audio and other things as well. So...
Yep. And I am Brent. I am the Connections Pastor here at Olive Branch. And I just want to encourage you, if you have any questions, send them to us by email to rabbittrail at obcc.church. We would love to hear your questions and discuss them. If you have any comments or feedback, we would love to hear that too. And like Greg says, we're just chasing truth wherever it runs, and these two over here are just cleaning up everything that I say. So,
are you like the rabbit, leaving a little trail?
I'm kind of like a rabbit, yeah. You never know. You never know what I'm going to say. I never know what I'm going to say, and sometimes it just there's a cleanup on aisle 4 that So,
I used to own a rabbit.
Yeah.
When I was little.
Yeah,
and it was a little black rabbit. We named him Lucky, really original. And
and they fill up their cage with Cocoa Puffs, right?
No, we had like a little...
Don't eat those.
They didn't fill up the cage. He filled up a giant, I know, I got to remember I was like 5, so I'm sure the giant thing was probably a little smaller, and I think but it was a big pail. And that's, I think when you're saying clean up after Rabbit Trail, that's just the wrong image for me growing up. So are you guys still riding high after Friday?
I am. Yeah. I think it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun for me, and it seemed like everybody there had a good time. So
I discovered I have a depressive personality, and I was just bummed at the end of the night. And I was just kidding.
What was nice is to see that people who go to our church here locally didn't know people from other services and got to meet them for the first time. Because we all see them all. We all think, oh, yeah, we all go to the same church. But if you go to a different service and you never browse the other services or get to know other people, you probably don't always link together like you thought.
Well, I did discover that, Brent, you're far more useful to people than just setting up our questions and then making people laugh. In fact, I was talking to a couple people who are like, we just really appreciate Brent being on the podcast because he takes your answers and they make sense to me now. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Sometimes,
cleaning up whose messes here. Brent.
Yeah. I don't even make sense to myself half the time. Well, one of the cool stories from that night too was 2 of our earliest encouragers for this was Lisa Lees and Debbie Redinger, and they're always, they both work here at the church for the school, and they're always encouraging you in the hallways, just, hey, I loved it, and talking about it. And so there's been many times I've been eating lunch in the kitchen and had conversations with both of them about the rabbit trail and all this stuff, and they've asked me questions. I didn't realize I never had a conversation with them together. They didn't know, and they're good friends here, they didn't even know that the other one listened to the rabbit trail till they both showed up that night. And they're like, oh, you listen to the rabbit trail? So it was, to me, that was part of the fun of the evening, was just getting to connect with everybody and everybody get to connect, and kind of this little community that is... that has been formed.
And there are more of you out there. Those of you who we missed you, and we knew we heard from a bunch of guys. We get that can happen.
And many of the people that don't even attend now have the option of watching the video. Like I have friends that I've known from ministry or other places past that'll watch, and they don't even live in the state. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So those of you that don't know, it's if you go to the Olive Branch YouTube channel, we videoed the live event, so you can watch it and just kind of get a feel for what the
see if our voices match the way we look.
Well, that's always a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Right? You're like, oh, wait a minute. They do have voices for radio.
Yeah, voice for radio.
Yes. I mean,
not a face, but
now a voice for podcasting.
Just when I was watching it, I just kept thinking, now I understand what Nancy sees in me.
I knew something like that was coming.
Yeah.
All right. So good time. We had a lot of fun. And so we would love to hear your feedback too. What did you like about the show? And I did have people say we need to do it again. And we definitely will do it again, I hope. Probably not.
Definitely, I hope.
Yeah, definitely, I hope. But it probably
Jesus
won't
might
be
come
that
back
often.
before then.
It'll
Yeah.
probably be a couple of times a year.
Lord willing.
Because we wanted to keep it fresh too. And it gets
Lord
stale if
willing,
we
the
do it.
creek don't rise.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that whole thing. Yeah.
All
Got it.
right. So we did get a couple of questions this week, so let's jump into those. And
we
so
got
one
a
of them
question?
was from Nate, and he asked a lot of questions, man.
He's got
good questions
He's
too.
got good questions.
So here's his question. It says, in Philippians 1, 17 and 18, Paul talks about how he doesn't care that people are preaching Christ and trying to cause trouble. He says that it doesn't matter because Christ is being preached. Does he mean that we shouldn't care about groups like progressives as long as Christ is being preached? Just a question about the verse. So again, if somebody is preaching Christ and they're kind of doing it in a way that doesn't represent the gospel correctly, are we still in favor of that because Christ is being preached?
Yeah, first, just starting straight up with the text, it reads this way: the former proclaim Christ. I'm reading from the Lexham English Bible. The former proclaim Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely thinking to raise up affliction in my imprisonment. What is the result? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. There's different viewpoints on how this text reads and whether he's talking about some separate missionary group that's preaching like in like a competitive manner with Paul, like, hey, we're going to plant more churches than you. And there's a sense of like rivalry, or like a faction of his broke off and started trying to preach the gospel or something. Paul's point is that the gospel is still being preached. Christ is still being preached. Resurrection is still being taught. That he's not caring that whether their motivations are bad, that their motives are like to out church plant him. He's sort of like, whatever, at least the gospel's being preached.
And we do see that again in Acts 2, right? Where that magician or something is following them around and somebody's like, we need to stop this guy. And they were like, nope. The gospel's being preached.
You mix that up with like
The Skiva.
So Jesus has some guy. They're like, hey, there's a guy out there swearing by your name, and he's like, well, don't stop him. Paul, in his scenario, was being followed around by like an Apollos demon, and she was proclaiming this.
Oh, you're talking about 19?
Yeah, this is the Lord the Most High, or whatever, and he just gets so annoyed he casts the demon out. So
Acts 19, and it's the Python spirit, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now maybe Apollos was running around.
That one you want to
preaching.
cast out.
Yeah. Apollos is a preacher, also not the god Apollos, but
Yeah.
the Apollos from the Book of Acts. He was a preacher who was running around preaching, and that's the one that Priscilla and Aquila were like, hey, you're not preaching this completely right. Helped him out, reset him, and kind of like. Paul's good with him. They're like, he becomes like one of his entourage, like one of the popular preachers around. So there's a lot of these itinerant preachers roaming around preaching. And so he's saying like, whether they're doing it because they want to like say, oh, well, that Paul, he didn't know what he's talking about. I'll tell you really what's going on. He's like, I don't care. As long as the gospel's proclaimed, I'm good. Now, how that pertains to like the modern progressive church. And even this, Nate, I'm going to clarify for you a couple of things. Number one, there's kind of a couple, like everything's got like a spectrum, right? So a big long line where you got dots all along each direction. If you have if the gospel is the center point where you're supposed to be, there are going to be people who fall onto what we call a conservative line, or they're going to be like, we don't drink and we don't chew and we don't go with girls who do, right? That fundamentalist conversation with super rules and stuff like that to try to protect themselves from sin. They still believe in the gospel. The danger on their side is that they're going to end up preaching legalism and a lot of times uphold a theology or parts of theology that aren't necessary to believe in order to be saved. On the other side, and what I would call a progressive side, you have progressive Christians. Well, and I don't even know why they would use the word Christians. Some of these liberal churches that are progressive, quote unquote, wouldn't even believe in the resurrection of Jesus. They would claim that Jesus is a really great teacher. The Old Testament's a myth. There's a lot of these pieces. They may, and some of them even just out and out are just basically Unitarians at this point. And so we would say that they are not even preaching the gospel. So they wouldn't fit in this text.
Yeah, you can. This is a thing that happens a lot, even with people confusing the actions of someone with the motives of someone. Oftentimes, we don't actually know the motives of people, but we know that their actions can produce fruit, even if their intent is not. That's why some people resist doing good because they know their intent isn't wrong. Well, I can't scold my kids because I know I've done bad things. Well, you can still do bad things and scold your kids because it's the right thing to do, even though internally you're having a different struggle. The external good that you should do would be to do a further good. To subtract doing good, even though internally you're having struggles, would be to do another harm. So the idea, like you see this with worshipers, like if you're singing a song, most people don't know if you're the worship arts leader whether something's going on internally about your pride unless it manifests publicly.
Like you're thinking to yourself, man, I'm
look how
singing
great
so
I am.
good right now.
Other people are just like, I'm worshiping God, and like everybody's praising God. The words haven't changed. The way you would sing it wouldn't even be different if your motives were correct in the external expression of it. Now it'll leak out in your attitude and it'll leak out in other ways, but the outcome of that God can still use. And I think that's kind of what Paul's saying. He's like, this is really the gospel they're preaching. I know some of these guys, I know what they're doing it for, but they're still preaching the gospel. So if they're preaching the gospel, I believe in God that he will empower this for my benefit. He's talking about, even though I'm in prison, this is not going to come back and attack me just because you're preaching the gospel because you don't like me or not.
So let's take it a little further. Let's go with evangelical progressives.
Wealth and health.
Well, let's take it at a different angle where not even the health wealth gospel, but there are some evangelical pastors. You know, at first they may be egalitarian. I don't have a problem. I'm not egalitarian, meaning like that women can be elders and senior pastors and stuff like that. We don't hold that position, and we have our reasons why. And I don't know why God did it that way, but I really think that's what the Bible teaches. But if they're a progressive, they're not progressive. If they are in that camp of egalitarianism, I don't think they're not preaching the gospel. Like that's not, we divide over practice in that sense, but not as brothers or sisters in Christ. Now, it gets a little bit more squishy when you have pastors who are proclaiming the gospel but won't say things like certain sexual sins, like maybe homosexuality or sleeping with your boyfriend or your girlfriend and living outside of, living with your boyfriend or girlfriend before you get married. These kinds of things that they would say, oh, that's not sin. If they didn't say that was sin, now we're starting to play with the gospel itself. Like they would still proclaim that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. They would still proclaim that Jesus died for sins. They would still proclaim that, there's only one way to heaven. But at another way, they're saying, but when it comes to these things, there's a change. We need to. It's not that bad. And that's where I struggle, because at what point have we changed the definition of sin so much that, why do those sins get passes and other sins don't get passes? At what point does Jesus' blood apply to transform us? And if those things aren't sin, what kind of other behaviors then are we calling sin that Jesus doesn't have to transform us from, right? So this starts to get way more into like, are we preaching the same gospel, or are we like literally just confusing ourselves in some ways? And I do struggle with that. I get really worried about Christians who are not Christians who are taking that on, because I think Christians can get confused, but pastors who are proclaiming these kinds of things are starting to fit a very tight pattern found in the Bible, which is a false teacher.
Yeah, their Galatians passage is what comes to mind, because he gives a list of things that you could do in the flesh with adultery, fornication, uncleanliness, lewdness. He goes through this whole list, and he says, I tell you beforehand, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God, because what they're practicing and saying is good is counterintuitive to the gospel. And so for when I look at that, I think, if you're adding a bunch of things to the gospel, is it really the gospel anymore? And so you have to kind of weigh in how much of that can you compromise before you're actually just compromising the nature and character of God at some point. And so to practice some of these things and say these are good, you might be in error, but after a while you keep practicing these things, you're kind of muddying the water to the point where you're just teaching people to be in the flesh, which sounds very much like Gnosticism in the early church, where people were adding a lot of things, using some of the same terms, but really changing the nature of what Christianity was by saying, you could do these things, but they're not as bad as you think they are, or that, the flesh is different from the spirit. And so, it's okay. Whatever's going on in your spirit is different. So these were the churches that they really pushed back against this kind of the Gnosticism, saying this is compromising the faith. So.
Yeah, in Jude, it kind of hits this idea that a false teacher is going to be all about promoting homosexuality and excusing it. Michael Green, in his commentary on this passage in Jude 8 says, despite that, in the same way, these men, because of their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the majestic beings. And so he goes into this whole conversation that this is what they're doing in their preaching. And Michael Green, in his commentary, says that where it probably indicates that the false teachers supported their antinomianism, which is like there's no law that we have to worry about, laying claim to divine revelations in their dreams. So they're legitimately using their own authority against scriptural authority to try to proclaim certain things are good, probably because they want to indulge in them themselves. And so it's difficult. I would say then, Nate, just again, I guess the bottom line for you, and definitely know for a real progressive church that's way out there are going to be people who are wrestling with that. I think we give them grace, but then there are pastors who I think are toting a dangerous line because they are either false teachers and they shouldn't be teaching, or they're just scared and confused and unwilling to draw a true line.
Draw a hard line.
Yeah, but yes, I would be fine if the gospel is really preached, but that's a question. Is it really being preached?
And one of the things too is, a lot of it is motive. If you're teaching a false doctrine, what is the motive? Is it just an ignorance, like you didn't really understand, and so there's an innocence to it, or is there a maliciousness to it, for self-gain or whatever? But again, that's why one of the things we got to be really careful when it comes to proper theology, where you get one side and you become too legalistic, you get on the other side, you become too liberal, and on both cases, the gospel message suffers, and not only that, you're leading people down a false path, of security. You can do whatever you want, and God covers everything, and it doesn't matter. You don't even need repentance. That's a false gospel that will lead you down the wrong path of security. And then the other one is you've got so many laws and hurdles in place that you don't need the gospel anymore.
Yeah, well, my fundamental problem often with progressive theology is the hermeneutic they applied to the text itself. Well, they'll kind of, if it's gray, then they give you the benefit of the doubt in any sense. And so if you can make it more gray, and some people you'll get down to, well, we don't know whether this passage is saying yes or no about a particular sin, so we just need to give love and compassion. I'm like, well, if you don't know anything about the scriptures, how can you proclaim Christ as true? If you can proclaim that as true, but everything else is gray. And so I'm like, well, you have a consistent way of looking at the text in the way that you exegete the text, the way you pull out context, the way you look at the actual intent. You look at it comparatively to the Old Testament and the New Testament. Just because there's confusion, or you can add ambiguity and confusion, doesn't mean there isn't an answer. It just means we need to work a little harder. It doesn't mean like, well, none of us know, so we need to be extra gracious. And I'm like, some of these issues that are primary aren't things you can just let go. It's like, well, if my car's broken down and it's going to blow up, we can't do anything about it because we really don't know if that's happening. I smell smoke, but it's too complicated an issue. And so oftentimes it's when they start looking at a text I've even heard progressive pastors, they'll say, well, this is all relevant. We need to add other truths. And they'll say, well, add psychology. And I love psychology, but it needs to be compatible with scripture, not supersede certain aspects of the nature of human existence. And so they start adding science and other things. And I love all those things, but they're adding it because they say the Bible is incomplete to give you an understanding of the human condition and who the nature and character of who God is. And I'm like, yeah, I don't see it that way. Because like, oh, he said that, but it really doesn't mean that. And so you start getting into that where you actually don't have a hermeneutic. You just like the commentary you like, and you dislike the commentary. And then when you pin them down, go, well, how do you know what you like and dislike? What you get is, well, how dare you question me? I mean, you don't have all the answers, and you don't get a combination going, well, you see, here's how I pulled this out of the text. And you'll see it in like Romans when people debate what Paul is saying about sexuality.
I don't want to ignore the danger on the other side, right, where you become so callous and cruel that you're kicking people out of your church just because you don't want to put up with their sin. Like if they're struggling with homosexuality, like you're like, you got to leave. It's like, No, you're welcome here if you're struggling through this, even if you're
Struggling is the key word.
right. Well,
Also,
I mean,
authority. Are you a pastor of the church struggling with that issue, or are you just a parishioner? Those are totally different positions.
or even with heterosexuality, in the sense of like, I don't like the two terms, because any sexuality outside of marriage is sinful sexuality.
We all
and
struggle.
so that. And everybody struggles with that at some level, in or out of marriage. And so, again, I think it's important to keep sin as sin. And that's why I don't like the conversations in the first place, because they really start messing with categories in the gospel itself. And that's when I start just going like, why? Why do we need to do this? Why don't we just say the Bible calls all these things sin, and let's deal with all of them, whether they're gluttony, or whether it's addiction to exercise, or hey, you're out there and you're not disciplining your children because you're afraid that the government's going to be mad at you, or whatever. And I do think there's places you can get to that it's sin, and it's not just opinion, because Scripture gives us indications on what directions we should go. But anyway, I go too far.
All right. We have another question, and it is from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, again. So she says, first off, I want to say I am so glad you guys hosted the live event. That was a lot of fun, and I hope you do it again.
We're glad you came.
Yes, we are. Also, thank you for the Starbucks gift card and for always answering my numerous questions. You are welcome.
Brent said that he wanted to let all of you know who got gift cards. He's available to go hang out at Starbucks.
Exactly, yeah. We'll do our own little podcast. So she says, I didn't write my question to drop in the bucket on my way out because parenting bedtime duties were waiting for me, but I also wanted to ask, when did Lucifer get kicked out of heaven with a third of the angels? Was that pre-Adam and Eve, or even before the days of creation? Is that why he was in the garden to tempt Eve? Thanks again, Lisa. I'm going to let you guys talk about this real quick. But I will say this. I went back and looked because when I saw that question the other day, I'm like, I swear we talked about this before. So I went back, and I think that it was episode 50. So if you want to go back and listen to episode 50, we talked about the gap theory. And I think that was where we were talking about the fall of the angels and everything else. Not 100% sure because I didn't listen to it.
Yeah, sir. We can actually address it more directly instead of like around the rabbit trail into like the gap. Because I think the surprising answer to many Christians is it didn't happen. That didn't happen. That is actually Milton's idea, trying to interpret a bunch of texts, but there is no real text that is like he took 1/3 of the angels with him. In fact, Stephen, you and I have both read the same stuff. Go ahead and jump further on that while I pull some of this stuff up.
Yeah, what you're getting in is people combining in Revelation chapter 12, where it talks about 1/3 of the stars were swept from the sky by the dragon, and that whole passage there, what you're seeing is kind of, you see the birth of what looks like the Messiah and the birth of the church and the dragon, and so you have all this imagery that's going on here that people debate over. Somewhere in that, people are like, well, that must be where the war in heaven happened. So Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, and Bugs Bunny, who really picked it up and popularized it.
Really?
So you see the ideas of heaven and concepts have come from a lot of our pop culture. There's actually no verse that says 1/3 of the angels fell from heaven. Now, there are passages even in Revelations 12. All of it hinges on Revelations 12, by the way. There's other passages they'll pull in from the Old Testament, but it doesn't say that the war in heaven took place in Eden at the time, and then that's how come.
In fact, it implies the war in heaven, that this war in heaven, verse 7, is happening after
the birth
of Christ and much of the church age.
Yep.
So there is a sense that this is a future situation, not a past situation. And so there is some confusion even in the timeline conversation. And so what was Satan doing in the
what was he doing in the garden?
And when did they fall?
And was there a big war in heaven, in the sense that they were all in heaven and there was a war and then they fell down? Because the Bible in Revelation does say there was a war. So what does that mean? So,
Yeah, so I think the best place we could point you to right now, and he does a lot of good work on this, is Michael Heiser. He has a book called Unseen Realms that he goes into this particular conversation. And it is pretty surprising that this is more Milton than anything else, because Paradise Lost was so famous and was so iconic. So we'll point you there for your sort of good readings and check some stuff out. But go ahead.
His less scholarly book is called Supernatural, so it just depends on what level you want to take it at.
Yeah.
Unseen Realms pretty thick. Some people are like, whoa, this is really a mind buster for them, but I love the fact that he even made 2 versions of it. And then he has one just on demons, so if you really want to know the bad guys and not the good guys, he wrote one on demons and one on angels.
Right. So it's really good stuff. It's scholarly backed and all that kind of stuff. The piece that is interesting, though, is okay, so when did Satan fall? There is some indication that Satan does fall, obviously. He has to eventually sin. We see that in kind of this place in Ezekiel where they're talking about this king of Tyre. And what's odd about the king of Tyre is that he is kind of in a space where he shouldn't be, right? He's in the garden of God. He's walking around in the actual mountain of God. I believe it's I'm looking for it here. Ezekiel, is it
34? Is it
28? 28:11.
Yeah.
28. There you go.
12, 11, 12, 18, in that area.
I think
Go ahead and take it.
Isaiah 14.
Ezekiel 28:12. This is the Son of Man rising in the Lamentations.
Yeah. Okay. So it says, you are the perfect model of an example, full of wisdom and perfect of beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone was your adornment. And it goes kind of all through those different ones. Gold was the craftsmanship of your settings and your mountings in you. On the day when you were created, they were prepared. So it's almost like he's this picture of the high priest in some ways, because he's got all that same looking stuff. You were an anointed guardian cherub, and I placed you on God's holy mountain. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day when you were created until wickedness was found in you. And that's kind of the ugly turn. In the abundance of your trading, they filled the midst of you with violence, and you sinned. I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I expelled you, the guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. And so the primary thing is somehow, this is where a lot of people get that Satan fell from his pride, that somehow he was part of the heavenly host that led worship, and don't think like singing worship, think like celebratory. He was a high priestly kind of person, being, that kind of stuff. And some people will argue that's not true, but this is clearly a connection between the king of Tyre and this satanic being. And so or as we would know him, as a satanic being. And so this being is probably the serpent, probably the one who in pride and his beauty usurps humanity and tries to gain power over humanity and finds himself thrown out. And so this is the place where he's thrown out of not heaven, but out of Eden. And so kind of at that point wandering and doing some different things. So we don't know what day this was, if this was we don't know what time period. It's obviously after Adam and Eve. Why he would suddenly tempt Adam and Eve, why he would go against God, and then later why others who are part of God's heavenly host would do that, and to the point where God himself will disinherit the nations at Babel and give them over to these fallen angelic or beings, the spiritual beings. It is quite a complicated and interesting storyline, but it starts kind of here with this pride, and we wouldn't have a date to set on it. It actually, as several people pointed out, there's multiple falls throughout the book of Genesis, from chapter 3, where humanity falls, all the way through till you get to Babel and the flood. To Babel, post-flood. And that's that final, national falling. All of humanity is spread out. Prior to that, there's, every single time humanity or the angelic are trying to take God's place. And so we're all on the same rebellious team throughout Genesis 3 all the way to chapter 12.
And then, now Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, and it kind of sounded like they were talking about the oppressor and all this stuff, and I think people attribute that to the fall of Satan. In verse 12 it says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You set in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of the assembly." So it kind of goes in there, and then there's like this fall where he's cast to Sheol. Is that part of, you guys know this stuff better than I do. So is that part of the perceived fall of Satan, or is that talking about something else? Do you know?
What's the passage again?
Isaiah 14.
Isaiah
It's
14.
the downfall of the king of Babylon. I wouldn't be ready to completely endorse one way or the other. I'd have to do more study on it, to be honest. Because
usually in the Hebrew, this phrase "cast to the earth," "cast to the earth," "cast to the earth" shows up in many passages, and typically in the tradition of the Hebrew, "cast down into the earth" or "to crawl on your belly" kind of stuff with serpent in the garden is the curse that you see is kind of he's now residing in the world of the dead. So now you have this Satan figure who takes the authority away from that God gave mankind. Now he has the authority over death and life, and now we're kind of captured by him, or death. We're captured by him, and so his curse is to be put in the abode of the dead. And so when you died in the Old Testament, you went to Sheol, and you were waiting for the Savior to come and remove you from Sheol. So that the early traditions has the curse of Satan being that he fell to the earth. In one of the ways of falling is that you're now the ruler of the underworld of the dead, and now when souls die, they go to you. And now Christ on the cross, he reverses this situation by conquering death, and now he is the one that determines where people ultimately reside through Christ himself. So that's kind of the ideas that are spent around in the text there. So yeah. And then you have in Ephesians where Satan is talked about the prince of the air. And so you have this kind of cosmology again coming up where there's this spirit world which he has a dominion over. But because Christ has taken away the authority, the church is supposed to reclaim those sections which he once owned. But those who are still under his control are the ones that haven't submitted to the Lord. So part of the gospel message is to really go around and proclaim the captives free from the grip of Satan, because now that they've been set free, they don't know that they've lost. So it reminds me a lot of like June 19th or Juneteenth, where the slaves didn't know that they had won the Civil War was won for them, and they were still in this captive state. And then they declare, and then they celebrate. Oh my gosh, we're now a part of the freedom. That's very much the picture of the gospel in the sense that we go into the domain that Satan once ruled because of our sin that God redeemed us from, and now proclaim you don't have to be held by Satan and the prince of the air. And so you have that prince language there. So it's kind of interesting. So there's a realm in which he still has dominion, but it has no power if Christ has proclaimed the gospel.
Yeah, whether or not Isaiah 14 is talking about that or not, I give it more time, take a look at it more deeply, because it's got a lot of the cosmic language in it. It's got a lot of Canaanite imagery too, so it's kind of hard to take a little while to kind of mesh that all out.
Unfortunately, a lot of the early early traditions of the church do come out of some of the Catholicism, some of the traditions around Catholicism. You have a lot of people's view of hell coming from Dante's Inferno, and again, Bugs Bunny cartoons. And so to me, it's good to kind of go back and assess now that we understand Second Temple literature, and that's kind of what Heiser's trying to do. Even the Bible Project has a really cool spiritual being study where it just kind of goes through each of the spiritual beings. What's a cherubim? What's a seraphim? What's a demon? What's an angel? Who's Satan?
What's a Nimrod?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Well, who's Satan is because a lot of people don't know that's not a name, and so the idea he's the adversary or...
it's not a name in the Old Testament. It is a name in the New Testament.
It becomes a name, but the way it's used, it's a title. Even in the New Testament, it's Hasatan. I mean, even in the New Testament, you're borrowing from the name. So it's and diabolis. Those phrases are still words that you've made a public name, but they are still a title in the sense like you go mom. You can say mom. Well, that mom becomes the mom or my mom.
Yeah, in the New Testament, it actually in the history. If you read his Demons book, you'll find out that there's a massive shift in the terminology in the middle of the Old Testament and the New Testament and the intertestamental periods, as they call it, where the name the Satan becomes becomes his name. So it's like what they would have called what's the goat demon?
Azazel.
who is most likely the original name, not Lucifer. That's a Latinized form of the son of the morning, day star, which is more likely Ishtar, which is a
Venus,
a Canaanite goddess. So
it's a Venus star.
So anyway, it's like you get all this stuff, and by the time it gets to the New Testament, Satan is particularly used as the name, the title of the leader of the enemies of God, in that sense, the fallen.
So again, I just Lisa punched it. I think it's episode 50. Check it out. See if that fills in some blanks too. But one of the things I think we can clearly determine is we can't clearly determine, exactly what it is. There's a lot of theories and speculation out there. So
yeah, it's a great place for speculation and interest and diving in. I think that's why Milton's ideas are not necessarily unfounded. They're popular, but they've been, to this point, like most scholars go like, that's not really what that is.
Yeah, you want to really go back to the original readers and say, well, what were they thinking when this stuff was written? And you'll find that it might be different than some of the traditions that we've added to it.
All right. So now we're going to get into the sermon. We started the new series, the Jesus Spiral. This was kind of the pre-series sermon.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to get into a lot of the details because a lot of it was about, joining small groups and stuff like that. But the thing that stood out in this too was community, and the passage being Acts 2:42, and the idea that community is going to cost you something. Being a disciple of Christ is going to cost you something.
Well, I would say those are even two different things. Like being a disciple of Christ will cost you. We'll talk a lot about that this coming week. But community itself, just in general, even secular community, is going to cost you.
His grace is a free gift that costs you your life. So,
what?
So again, I'll just read real quick. Acts 2:42 says, and they devoted, talking about the early church, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers, and awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together, and they had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and their belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day they attending the temple together, breaking bread in their homes. They received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God, having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Amen. So, again, some of the things that come out of this too is this idea that that no one was without need. They were selling their possessions.
If they were selling their positions, that's called simony.
Yes.
The sale of the positions in the church, that goes back to Simon Magus. Wrong.
So if anybody wants to be the senior pastor of Olive Branch, just put in your application, and then we'll tell you
$2 million.
Yeah, please make that check out to Brent Branchard.
Wait, you can't sell my position.
Okay, so they were selling their possessions and their belongings so that they could meet each other's needs and everything else. Now, this sounds a lot like communism, right? Where this sounds a lot like communism. We look at communism as a bad thing. So
not everyone does.
Everybody.
Right. So number one, is this communism? And if communism is a biblical model, why are we so opposed to it?
All right. Well, first and foremost,
it's a light little topic.
Yeah. No. I think what's interesting is I always like to play this thought game, if communism, or let's just put it this way, I don't think this talks about communism. First and foremost, while it talks about communalism, which is not communism. Communalism was the willingness to kind of view everyone's stuff as theirs, but it's still your stuff, right? So it's yours, but you're letting other people use it. Notice how they describe what's really going on here. It says that all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions. And so at this point, does that mean they're running over, grabbing some Uncle Sam's, his little liar and selling their possessions because everybody owns them. So now I'm going to, they own their own possessions and their own belongings, and they're selling them and distributing the proceeds to each other as any have need. So this is how they're being communal with it. They're saying, oh, well, you're in need. Yeah, I'm willing to get rid of my thing to help you out. And so there is this very real sense of people going like, I don't need that, and I don't need that, and I've got this, and I can help you, and you can help, and they're helping. And so suddenly everybody's needs is being met. I think you were in the small group when we used to talk about it, like, man, what would happen if in a church, if somebody started the chain, right? They're like, I've got so much wealth and I want to pay your house off, but I'm asking you that you would then not keep your your payments going, but both you and I will go use our payments and we'll go pay that guy's house off, and then the three of us will do it again. After about at the fourth one of us will drop off, and then we'll just keep doing that. How quickly would everybody's homes get paid off? It's just like, you suddenly are like, oh, that would be so, but somebody has to start it, and it has to be somebody with possessions to be able to do something like that. That would be closer to this idea of what I think is going on in the text, where they're like, I don't need all these homes, I don't need all this stuff. You need these things. You need a house. You need this. And they didn't have this like, well, you didn't work, and they did have that. You should work. You had to work, or you didn't eat, that kind of concept, because they weren't going to abide by people being what they would call lazy. That's opposite of what
Sluggard.
a sluggard in the Old Testament. So these were industrious people. They were working hard, but they were doing it for each other, not just for themselves. The better way to put this, and this is where I just disagree with Ben Shapiro. If you've ever heard him talk about like
in his house, he's
like, we're communists in the house. I'm like, no, you're not. You're communal. Like your kids still own stuff, and you still own stuff. You wouldn't say like your kids get to own your bed, and my son went out and sold my bed today because it's his bed. No, it's not communistic. It's communal. It's family. Family works different, and this is family. And that's what you're reading. This is how family works.
Yeah, to me, socialism really is a economic and political system that's enforced by a government against the will of everyone. I mean, it's imposed on people. People maybe at the beginning start to agree with it, but you have to abide by it if you live within that system. This one here, though, is voluntary. So there's a big difference between government coercion of sharing of common goods and the voluntary giving up of your goods to bless somebody. One doesn't require the government. And I think this isn't saying like form a government and decide that no one owns anything.
Yeah, Rome wasn't showing up making them taking their possessions and distributing them for them, going like, we'll play the middleman, we'll be good for you, and we'll take a little piece.
Yeah, they were doing this within a system that was political already on its own. They did this of their own accord so that they could care for one another and love one another, meet each other's needs. They also could hold people accountable because they had a spiritual understanding that they shared in common about Christ and the center of Christ. So though we conflate any kind of communal experience with socialism in our culture, the idea that you can love people and do nice things for them minus a government does not mean that you're a socialist. And if you've been taught that, you've been taught wrong, because socialism requires that everyone pay into it for it works. In fact, you punish those who don't abide by the government system because they are endangering the people. And so you have to keep that in mind.
Well, I'm gonna play a little mind game now. I kind of mentioned earlier, and I think this is kind of interesting because I do think you can think of a Christian form of socialism,
sure,
in the sense that the people are willing to help each other out, and they are using the government as the means for gaining the needs because the country's too large or whatever, and so they know all the needs are in one area, so we're gonna allow the government to help us. But these people wouldn't use taxation, they would use donation. A Christian form of socialism would be, we're using the government to funnel funds through into, if you could trust your government, that it would work fine.
Every distributors.
Right, as the distributors. Every system even the finders, like finding people. Every system, however, breaks down because of sin. And I think like, for example, I think you can find Christians who live in China that have a vision of a type, and I would say, and I'm going to use this carefully, a kind of Christian communism. And I can't, those words don't go together because communism is atheistic and has its own kind of
same with socialism,
vision for life and stuff like that. but I think that they have a sense of like what it could look like as Christians communally, and it's not going to be a crony capitalistic system or a capitalistic system necessarily. They may end up not. I mean, could it be possible that the future of a Christian form of a different kind of, you name it, and something other than capitalism could evolve or come out of a Christian China? I don't know. Again, my point is like the gospel doesn't hang its hat on whether you're communist in your economic system or socialist on your economic system or capitalist in your economic system. Like, I don't actually particularly think that has a stake in whether you're saved or not. Now, which one I think works better and which one I believe allows virtue to flourish more is going to be a better debate in that sense. And I do think that having people be trained and free to be able to go out and do to exercise their freely given virtues creates a better virtuous society and allows people to grow. But it also opens the door for more vice so people can sin. And so that's always the tension in a free society like ours. It's made for virtuous people. It's made for Christian people. But when we stop advancing Christianity, it starts to become corrupt. And that becomes a thing that capitalism is ugly with. In a way, it can enhance virtue or it can enhance vice. And right now it's enhancing vice. And so it's going to produce what you put into it. So I think that the difference is then a coercive form of government is just anathema to anyone who wants a free faith, because we coming from England, having a background in the West and in England where the government and the religion was so meshed together that you had 100 years wars and these things of Catholics versus Protestants, and when you were not a Protestant, then you actually were against the law. I mean, like that kind of stuff, they don't have a stomach for it over there now, but they're still not willing to get rid of this state functioning church. And so you end up with us in America. We're like, no, what's the first freedom? Freedom of religion and speech so that we can practice our faith in good conscience, which means then you get the second, which is defense. And it goes down from there into these different pieces. And so there have been a lot of people that argue for a truly free Christianity, you need a free country, which needs a free economics. That's Adam Smith's argumentations. But again, could there be other concepts out there that Christians hold to? Yes. But this is not endorsing a communism. It's endorsing a family community concept.
Now, again, if you want to take that, okay, so this is like a perfect model, right? These people are believers, they're all, together in the same community, and there's a responsibility to one another to help each other get through times of trouble and finances and whatnot. So, again, would you say in this picture here that it's insular, like, okay, this is the church doing for the church. We're not doing for everybody. We're doing it for the church, and so, and again, I mean, the difference between then and now is so drastic, where the sense that these people lived together, they did life together, they knew each other intimately, where we don't live in a community like that anymore.
Not anymore, no.
So again, if we're trying to like live by this verse, what does that really look like in the church today?
Oh, resurrection bands.
Yeah.
Is that where you're going?
The greatest band that ever lives. No, but they do live in a Christian community, commune. But no, I'm just like, is this, when we think of this, is it about meeting everybody's needs? Is it really just about being sacrificial for one another as brothers and sisters in the Lord in this community, local community here, like Olive Branch, And so really, like, how sacrificial should we be, and who should we be sacrificial to?
Well, these are great questions. I mean, that kind of fits your social work background if you want to take a stab at it. But I have a basic rubric first before I let you go, and that is to the church first, to the world second. That you should meet the needs within the church before you then reach out to meet all the needs outside. And other people who say, no way. I'm like, but put it this way, why reach all the needs of people outside if you're going to bring them in and then stop meeting their needs? Right? Like, that's ridiculous. It's opposite. No, you want to be the kind of community where they know they're going to have their needs met if they're in amongst you, even if you're meeting them outside. So I always say to the church first, and I think that's the biblical position.
Yeah, those are all kinds of things, because I still have questions about socialism and communism. But
you jumped on it.
Yeah, going back to just that argument real quick is I think we live in a world that likes to nuance things. You know, we
that doesn't like to nuance things, or does?
Well, it likes to make general things that are actually nuanced and get you to be confused on terms. So we say socialism or communism, and they'll say, well, that works here. I was like, what you are doing is actually modifying socialism and communism oftentimes to make it work in a society. So I think Christianity, you don't need a law, you don't need a government if you have fruits of the Spirit being exercised. So whatever structure may work if people are actually abiding by the fruits of the Spirit, because they care for one another, and they're going to find ways to do it within any system. But there are certain things, like when you say the word communism, you are saying an atheist system that it is looking at humanity in a certain way, that they can't meet their own needs. They need a strong hand from the government to kind of get everybody to get together. So I do think in some of these things are counterintuitive, but that doesn't mean that parts of what they've done in history that we can't use in a Christian way to bring about a good. But also in our world, if you do any kind of public good for somebody, automatically people think it's a handout, and it's not. You know, they go, I don't want to give anything to anyone that doesn't deserve it. And so you have some of these old arguments that come from when the church first started helping people socially, and just the debates that, you know, we don't help those that can't help themselves, right? And the problem with that is that in Christianity, God helps people who can't help themselves. That's how you got to be a Christian. And so some of this is I might help someone who doesn't deserve my help in order to preach the gospel to them. I might get involved because they may need the grace that says, I'll love you even in your mess, even though you don't deserve it. And I have to weigh that benefit from all the people in the community I help, because there are some people that I could help better with my resources than others. And there are people that are going to take advantage of that, but I have to give them an opportunity to take advantage of it. If I say, well, I don't know, I don't trust anyone, I won't help anyone unless I know the outcome, then you're going to have a lot of problems helping the poor, and just in my experience. So usually it's a relationship. You start with grace, and then you work towards truth in that grace so that they can live more free. So when you offer help in the community, I'm just talking outside in the community, it does require that the more help you ask, the more I get to know you, the more I love you, the more I tell you the truth, the more I want to integrate you into a family, whether it's this church or another church, or the truth in general, or to talk about decisions in your life or whatever, to help you be autonomous in some sense, but communal in another. And so for me, I might help someone that does. People will ask, why do you help that person? They don't look like they can do anything. I'm like, well, no, maybe they never had the opportunity, someone to show them grace. I have to let them know the truth, though. I can't just go out, help people, and never tell them that life could be lived a different way. and I can alleviate your pain, but you have to ask the question, what got you here? What's going on in your heart? What's going on in your family? What do you value? What is going on that I can help you actually be free? And to me, the only way to do that is with the gospel, to tell you about Christ that ultimately makes you free, even if you're all hooked up socially with all these problems. And so that's how I look at social stuff. But if I bring you into the church and we don't care for each other, then I just brought you into a worse condition. Mm-hmm. So the idea that Greg's talking about, I do agree that, and I would love to see more, some way that we hung out so well, that we loved each other so well, that in and of itself is evangelical in the sense it's inviting people to be a part of something they've never had before, to show them a little bit of heaven. And then when they ask questions, you say, oh, here's why. Jesus. Because of Jesus, we gather and care for one another. Oftentimes, a large percentage of the church's resources will be to reach people or to get them to be aware of the church. But after 3 weeks of being there, they wouldn't want to live there. So you have to create a space for people to be attracted to find relationships they've never had before, people in a loving way they've never had before. So that's why discipleship and evangelism are so important, that I can't separate the two. You have to have people that are in a healthy community, so that when you bring them in that aren't from the healthy community, they don't fall down, they rise up.
And one thing I would like to talk about community too is, community, there's intimacy in community. And I think people can think, and I think kind of wrongly, that they are part of a community, like even at Olive Branch, right? I go to Olive Branch on a semi-regular basis.
Attendance.
Therefore, this is my community. But unless you are intimately involved, that you are maybe attached to a community, but not in a community. And I think one of the difficulties that we deal with when we are trying to help people, whether it be from my personal, giving to somebody that might be in need, to a corporate giving to somebody that might be in need is the suspicion factor. Okay, do you really need help? Do could you really fend for yourself? Are you looking for an easy way out or a free handout? So there's that suspicion aspect that you have to overcome. And so that's one of the important reasons to be in community. And I think you even mentioned part of that in the sermon is whether it be financial, whether it be relational crisis or whatever that goes on in your life, it is much easier for the community to help you and meet your needs when you are in community already, rather than the crisis come and then you're trying to find a community to help you get through it. Because again, there is that suspicion factor, or I'm just not sure. But if you're intimately involved, that part of the caring and the nurturing is going to more naturally take place.
Yeah, going back to this section. Remember, this is communal as a family, right? And Joe Hellerman, who is a professor of mine over at Biola University, his focus was, and I think his recent book was When the Church Was a Family. His focus was always on like how the church saw themselves as brothers and sisters. That legitimately, he was like, listen, one of the biggest issues in the modern church is that we put the nuclear family before the church. That there is a sense that you and your kids have right to your money and your activities more than your quote spiritual brother or sister who is literally suffering over here because of life or whatever's gone on. And he's like, that is one of the biggest things that we as Americans are going to face the Lord over. Because he's like, that's not how it is. Oh, we're supposed to have an inheritance for our children and our grandchildren, and we're blessed. He's like, yes, but that's not the family we're talking about. We're talking about the church family. And in fact, those inheritances for grandchildren, stuff, that was much larger families in the ancient world than we're talking about here. You're talking 12 kids plus their grandkids. I mean, you have an inheritance. Yeah, you were blessed. The point in this case is no. When go work hard so you can help meet somebody's needs, right? Meet your own needs and meet somebody else. That's what he says in Ephesians. Stop stealing, go work hard so you'll have something, and then you can have something to help someone else. And so when I think about what you're talking about, like this suspicion when somebody shows up, like, oh, I really need some. Well, it's because you're not really part of the family, right? You don't, when your kid comes up to you and asks you for money, know whether or not they're mooching or whether or not they really need it, because they're your kid, they're your brother or your sister. And this is the case, like, one of the ways I think about, like, if you think of it, the Bible seems to place people in these categories of like what we'd call the true needy. Like you think of a child can't be the productive unit in the family. That's not what they're there for. They're there for you to care for. They're there for you to pour out towards. If a child has need, well, you give them what they need. And there are people in our communities that will be in that zone of a child. Like you think of the widow who's too old to be able to work. You think of the perhaps somebody who has got a mental disorder that can't do a job. Like we need to be able to provide for them like we would provide for our children, right? And that's a type of provision that's very expensive but very necessary. What we're all worried about is determining whether you're a child or a young adult, because the young adults are on transition, right? They're still kids that kind of need some help, but but the goal is to get them on their feet and get them moving. Otherwise, you loafer, get out of my house.
Or not even young adult, a failure to launch adult.
Right. No, that's right. And that's what we're afraid that there are people in this world who literally are that zone of life. Like they've just never launched. They don't want to launch. They just want to. And the Bible talks about those people. Those are the people saying, if you don't eat, you don't eat, if you don't work. Or you're a busybody as a lady just running around from house to house stop it and don't help them out. Like legitimately, Timothy's like, these are the kind of people that they're not part of the community. They're using the community. However, if you're in a situation where you find yourself like, oh my gosh, I'm in need, and you're transitioning, you're that young adult, but you would help them because they'd get on their feet and get moving. And so I do think that there is and then you have the producers. If you're an adult, produce with an eye out to helping one another so that we don't all fall into a despairing situation. The Jewish communities do this really well, actually, in a lot of cases. And it's one of the reasons the poverty isn't as great. amongst them.
That's why
Yeah,
they
one of
also
the
have to
things-
live within 7 miles of the synagogue too. So
So
they
that's
live
what
in,
kept their communities
that's
together.
that's what keeps their communities together.
And one of the things you were saying was they're using the community, and I would even go a step further. A lot of times they're stealing from the community in the sense that if we're helping somebody that is able-bodied and could take care of themselves, they're just choosing not to, then we can't help somebody that can't.
Yeah.
You know, and like I keep telling Nancy, and this is kind of hyperbole, but there's some truth in it too. She's talking about wanting to retire, right? And so part of me keeps telling her that, you know, any money we spend now, we're stealing from our retirement. You know, if we just are spending unnecessarily, then we are stealing from our future to live now. You know, and again, debt is that too. You are stealing from your future to do now. So again, it's that fiscal responsibility and how we treat each other, and how generous should we be in that regard too. And but again,
Sounds like as generous as necessary to the needy.
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, just people think they know who's mooching and who's not. And that's my only precaution. Oftentimes I'll tell a church, you might want to walk a couple miles with somebody, even though you know they're completely flawed, to point it out. They need the example of doing it. So if you already assume because you got with their neighbors or found out, oh, this is what we know about this person, you can be so suspicious that you never help anyone. And this is what I find more common in the churches that are affluent than not, is they've seen so many people take advantage of their kindness that they're just so skeptical that they won't help anyone because we live in the land of plenty. And I'm saying there's a way to walk through someone's dysfunction to point out their dysfunction in a way spiritually that a church could do that an individual can't. And you can say, like, here's limitations of our help. Here's why we don't give to everyone. Here's what we'll give you this time, but that next time, because we believe in responsibility, let me offer you some help and counsel on how to do your bills. We're actually doing more work, not less, by giving you more options within the community to grow. And yeah, we are going to challenge you. But if we just say, well, I can't give you help because you're going to squander it, then I don't have the opportunity to tell you why with the example.
And the struggle is that you can help people today, and if they don't want to grow up, they just jump to another church.
Yeah.
And so it's so hard to, and you're not, I just, all this kind of weird stuff in my mind, like you can't really tell somebody else, like, hey, we had that person here, so, you know, watch out.
You can,
or the other part for me is just like, I also want to point out that this isn't like these people were putting themselves further into need. This is another part that we have to remember, that they were selling their possessions and giving to the needy, but they weren't putting themselves in danger of becoming needy themselves.
Yeah, like taking like
not until the famine hit. And this is the case where you'd want to go like help another church or something like that. But what we want to realize is like A.W. Tozer, for example, amazing guy, wrote great stuff. When he didn't involve his wife in any of his finances, didn't tell her anything, gave half his salary back to the college he was working for, or the church he was working for, and wound up at the end of his life dying, you know, pretty young in the early 60s, and left his wife like $7,000 total. Like she was destitute and destroyed. And so it's like that is not
the biblical model.
That biblical model. So
yeah, now we're running out of time, but I just wanted to touch on one last thing before we go. So we're looking at this communal aspect to church and community. Now it talks about that they went to the temple and then they went to each other's houses, breaking bread and fellowshipping and all that stuff. And there is like two big views of church right now. I mean, not only two, but you know, the mega church, you know, or the house church. You know, what is the more godly model? You know, should it just be like almost a small group in a house, and we know each other intimately, we're growing and discipling and caring for one another, or is it go to the big church that has everything?
And the hard part right here is that when you get into these movements, they call the mega church or even the larger church the elephant church, and they call the home churches rabbit churches. So we all have to be for the rabbit churches, right?
Rabbit trails, yeah.
So
That's
anyway,
what the driveway is.
Let's clean up their messes. And I mean, I personally have a lot of frustrations with this conversation. Because, one, I'm not opposed to mega churches. I'm not opposed to venue churches. I'm not opposed to any way God wants to spread his gospel. Back to our first question. I think that the methodologies are going to be varied and different per culture. And so hey, in some cultures, house churches work. They typically work in very high authoritarian, high persecution places. And so the early church here before the persecution is happening is meeting in large settings and then small settings. You'll see Paul goes to the Hall of Tyrannus, and then he's teaching in homes. You have here the temple, and they're teaching in homes. Whenever they had a chance, the church would teach in larger settings and smaller settings because you were a family who didn't want to get together with their family in the town. And so you would say the church in Ephesus, are we saying that the church in Ephesus never all got together in their giant theater once in a great while to listen to some teaching? Perhaps, maybe one of the smaller ones. Perhaps it was in a home that was extremely large, and there are some extremely large homes in the ancient world. What I do find interesting is every time I've met somebody who's like, we're all house churches and house churches only, and God bless you, go for it. But guess what? All it takes is one charismatic leader in a house church, and all these people start rushing around that charismatic or good teacher, and that house church is suddenly 40, 50 people, and then it's 100 plus people, then it's 200 people, and suddenly you've got a church. And that's because people want to be in larger groups together. There's energy. There's more that can be done. There's more resources to share. There's more, like, when there's a need, like, it's hard. When you're in a small group and everybody's in need, nobody's getting help. So you better have a network. So they go, we're a network of house churches that's oftentimes too loosely affiliated to the point they don't even have a leadership, and it's kind of can get a little wonky. Others have good, strong leadership. I'm not going to say that wrong. But again, we're talking about persecuted churches, typically, where this thrives. Second persecution goes away. Historically, in modern time period, one thing happens. They all come out of their homes, and they all want to get together in big churches. So we end up with giant halls and giant cathedrals and giant places being built after the persecutions are gone. Why? Because Christians are like, I can finally see the other Christians, and we can all worship together. And everybody loves to hear a room of 1,000 people singing, and versus your 10, 12 people in your house. That, yeah, it's passionate and great, but man, it's so cool to go to the stadium when all the Christians are together and it's a Harvest Crusade night or something, and people are singing out with that's amazing. It's like, that's heaven. Which is closer to heaven, the house church or the giant mega church where tons of people are worshiping God at the same time? Typically, like I think of what Tim Keller said about the cities. Cities he's like, you need to reach the cities because there's more of the image of God there, because it's more dense with humanity, and there's more of those people, and so there's more wickedness, but there's more good. And so the argument for a megachurch would be you have a higher density of God's image and power and energy, but they move slower. They do. And there's room for house churches. That's why I think a balanced model of having small groups or small house units that are gathering together in large churches or large units for worship is really the best model that's been seen. And it's a pretty old model. So.
Yeah, and there's different names: small groups, life groups,
house groups,
D groups.
home groups.
Yeah, and I will just say that I do feel
groups.
I do feel that
those are
regardless of what size church you go to, right? If you go to a big church or a medium-sized church, small groups or life groups or whatever are important in the sense that really that's where the intimacy takes place. I mean, I think there is a form of intimacy in larger groupings, but you'll never be able to have the intimacy that you can have in smaller groupings. You know each other, you're known, and you care for one another. So,
yeah, there are different forms of belonging that typically I find, different spaces fill. Oftentimes we think, it's just the people, but oftentimes the arrangement of the physical place that you're meeting has limitations or strengths. The smaller that you're meeting, the smaller number, the more intimate people actually can gather and get to know each other. As the text says, they knew each other. But you're also, the larger the crowd, where all the focus is up, usually in a major sanctuary, you're looking at the teaching and it's coming up, there's kind of an up-down or an oratory towards you. We're all listening together. And then we may go leave and talk in smaller groups. So it seems like human beings need several avenues within the church to feel connected to human beings in different spaces. So you need your really close friends, like Jesus had 3 that he would bring around him when he would take them aside when he needed really, really intimate times. Then he had his group of guys that he knew him intimately. They kind of walked through life together. But he also went into synagogues and went in to see what believers and people who say they proclaim Yahweh's name are doing, interacting with them, having conversations. And then there's a form of worship that you would go to when you went to temple or in the area of the temple. And I think human beings need all of these experiences in order to be connected, and I think the church isn't any different. So I think when people just are lacking something in their experience, they gravitate toward that model. So if you're lacking, I really don't feel connected to people. I know the 6 people I'm around, I don't feel like I can really worship, and it feels like I'm isolated and alone in my Christianity. You get in a big crowd, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's more of us. This is a bigger movement. That experience moves you in a different way. But you might have the opposite experience. You might go to a mega church and don't even know anybody. The worship's great, but you just kind of leave and nobody says hi to you. Then you're probably like, well, I really need intimacy. You kind of need both these things. And so for me, it's the flexibility of being known in a smaller group and the congregation coming together in some way, however you choose to do it, that I think is helpful.
There's also a check and balance involved with larger and smaller. Larger churches are less likely, and this sounds weird, are less likely to retain, largest church in the world is a heretic world, but it is usually less likely to retain heresy. And the reason why is you have a larger group of people who are not heretical listening going, that's a heresy. And so they jump in. One of the problems with our lack of educating Christians in the last last 50 years or whatever is we get into health, wealth, gospel stuff, and you can fill a giant stadium with people. And I think that's what people think of it as a mega church. Most of your truly good mega churches are not health, wealth, gospel kind of people, and they're not actually very sloppy theologically speaking. They're actually pretty strong. The famous ones get famous for certain reasons. They're good at that kind of glitz and glamour. But I can think of some very, very powerful, very strong mega churches over the years that had extremely good teachers. And I can think of a lot of small groups that turned into heretical, crazy, like little Bible studies that turned into entire cults. In fact, most of our cults from the 1800s started out of home Bible studies. Lots of things that happen today that are heretical have been starting out of home Bible studies. And that's not to knock home Bible studies, but it's harder to oversee the teachings of small units than it is over one large unit. And so there's a balance in that as well. And so you do need leadership, and you do need the check and balance.
You need elders, especially.
And then there's one more thing kind of interesting that we're missing, though, in all this. And Steve and I had read a couple books on this. That's called a middle group. A middling group is not a small group. It's not your 12 people. It's not intimate 3 people, and it's not the giant 1,000 people. It's kind of right there, smack in the middle. It's why a lot of people like men's breakfast gatherings or women's groups
or a gathering or a barbecue or a potluck.
or post church potluck or the mission. It's what happens a lot of times in churches that have very good volunteer teams. It acts like a middle group, and a middle group is where you kind of drop your guard a little bit better. Because, man, it's pretty frightening sometimes in a small group if you don't know people. It can be very intimate. But in a middle group is kind of that area where I don't have to be anonymous, but I can engage and I can talk to people. They used to do these at formal dances, cocktail parties. There's these kinds of things that are out there in this world. Churches don't do this well since the fundamentalist age. They used to do the hoedowns and the dances and the stuff at the church. And you don't do that kind of things. And so we miss out on a lot of the social things that makes it feel like a family, that makes it feel like, what good's your extended family if you don't have the Christmas party? You can have the big family reunion, and that's crazy, but most of your family interactions are not one-on-one, it's at the dinner table. And if it's not at the dinner table, it's going to be at the party or whatever. And so this is the kind of stuff that even as churches, we have to remember there are even more aspects to this than even found in this text.
There's social and communal spaces are important because that's usually where you get to engage. People always say they're not really spiritual, but they're actually quite spiritual because it tells you who people are, and you get to engage at your own level. It's typically where people find their spouse or their best friends, is you go to a group of people and you have the freedom to talk to anyone. And you have the activity to kind of mask certain things.
Like a live rabbit trail podcast.
That's what it felt like. It was fun to hang out with people and get to know them.
And just, if you're going to a big church, man, praise God and worship God there and stay connected. If you are in a very small group or a church, a home church, then, be careful if they start serving Kool-Aid. But other than that, enjoy it.
Now, obviously, if the theology is good, enjoy the church you're in and be passionate about what God's called you to do. And don't be shocked if your church grows or if your church multiplies or breaks up or whatever. God loves to do all kinds of crazy things. So, but I guess this comes to the end of our time, and thanks, guys. It was kind of a fun little trail down some different things, and we hope that you guys enjoyed this as well. If you've got questions or you've got comments for us, maybe you're listening for the first time, you want to let us know, hey, you're out there, or if you want to kind of push us for when our next live is or whatever you want to do, we'd love to hear from you. You can let us know at rabbittrail@obcc.church. That's rabbittrail@obcc.church, and there were special cookies with that @ on it, and so you can see some of those on the photos.
Thank you, Dolores.
Yeah, so we're just we're glad that you joined with us, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Right, and Sylvia, I know you're sitting there going, hey, I want to send them a message. So get on it. Send us a message, and I'll hear from you guys later. Boom chakalaka.
Bye.